Becker, founder of the Love Foundation and author of several books, including this one, Unconditional Love Is, Appreciating Aspects of Life. What I'd like to do is to ask you about this book and about all this understanding of unconditional love and how it relates to all these different aspects of life, or how these different aspects of life relate to unconditional love, and what benefits they have for people, what practical benefits they have, why it's important. And I think what I'd like to do is to start by asking you to give me a rundown on what you believe unconditional love is and why it's important that we should develop unconditional love for ourselves.
Sure. Easy place to start. The
Good.
process for me is more of where I came to understand unconditional love for myself. Having been formerly in the business world, in the banking world at one point, and retail world, there's something going on inside of me that I realized I needed to explore more of who I was in a more intrinsic level, because I was not finding myself connecting very well to the outside world. Simply not quite understanding or reconciling the inner experiences I was having versus the outer experiences I was having. And that kind of led me on a journey to understand more of myself, self-help, self-awareness, self-growth type activity. And in the process of doing that, it literally almost stumbled across this notion of love. And I realized that, love is something that we use quite frequently in our modern day daily vocabulary. And yet it didn't seem to have much meaning to me. It either had a kind of emotional connotation, or it had kind of a physiological or even sexual connotation. We were just using love as a verb, as a noun, as an adjective, just in our daily commentary. In exploring it, I realized I looked at love more deeply as did it really mean to myself, my relationship to the people around me, and really eventually became something what did love mean with humanity at large. In exploring that aspect of love, I found that there were actually many aspects of love. I mean, where we're using love as say, I love my house, I love my spouse, I love my career. Love actually had a much deeper meaning when rightly understood, because in the experience of love, there was a whole range, a whole spectrum of feelings, thoughts, ideas, and experiences. And the more I delved into it, the more I began to understand that love actually had a whole variety of aspects to it, very positive, very uplifting aspects, part of each experience. When I was more in love, whether it was, in the state of self-acceptance or engaged with someone else, the understanding of love actually made me feel something different than my day-to-day normal experiences. So in understanding more of the aspects, I became to understand more of love as really being a way of being. And that seemed to be kind of a catch-all. It seemed to be like a kind of a general understanding of love as really a way of being, because in fact, love was an experience that I was having that was different than my common experiences. And then for me, I added the unconditional part, which is really being unlimited, being without limit. And I came up with a rather unique and unusual, perhaps modern day definition of unconditional love as being an unlimited way of being. The aspects, like in this particular book that you're referencing, these aspects, freedom, trust, things that we experience that are very, really natural parts of our day-to-day experiences, but not necessarily something that we really hone in on or focus upon. I realized that if I focused on each of these aspects, that I could actually expand them more and more in my consciousness, and therefore, if I expanded them more in my consciousness, they became a greater part of my experience. So recognizing the many positive aspects related to love, and in my work more of the unconditional love, that's how I kind of concluded that if we put more attention on loving aspects of our life, the more we increase that, in somewhat of a contrast to if I focus more on doubtful or fearful type concepts, I expand that. So for me, it became this kind of reality of shift that I went from a place of really living quite a bit of fear and doubt about myself, the life, the universe, and everything, into beginning to focus on the loving aspects that are intrinsic in every part of my life and exist all the time also.
So you start this book with a list of 63 different qualities or aspects, such as freedom, peace, as you say, wisdom, life, harmony, joy. Now, are you saying that in developing these different qualities, and presumably the fact that these don't really have any limit as such. I mean, you could say that there's no limit to the amount of freedom that you could experience or give, or peace or wisdom. That's where the unconditional element of it comes in.
Right, and in the way, if you, again, going back to kind of like this previous way I was living, I did everything for the right reasons, or what I thought were the right reasons, really ultimately to make other people happy and therefore make my life somewhat easier. Where I took this rather fundamental shift in my life and began to, or chose to understand myself. I chose to understand, the good, the bad, and the ugly within myself. What are the qualities within me that literally already exist? And the loving qualities already exist. The freedom is there, the peace is there, the wisdom is there. And yet when we are outward focused, we have a tendency to forget all these innate, amazing, truly unlimited qualities within ourselves. And so it takes a bit of readdressing and refocusing and bringing forth and adding and expanding our innate qualities. For example, many people around the world suffer from, the idea of lack of self-esteem. They don't really believe in themselves. They don't really have they don't feel worthy, for a variety of reasons. Childhood messages, ongoing suggestions, their circumstances, all seemingly very valid experiences, and yet they all compound to draw a person into a state of not feeling very worthy, not feeling like they have power within or that they can make any real change. They're really subject to everything that's happening to them. Where I came to understand that my thoughts and my feelings that I entertain in every moment of my life are the things that bring about my physical experiences. So if I'm entertaining lack of self-worth as a thought and a feeling, if I think and literally criticize myself inside with a thought that is critical in nature and draws me down, and if I feel unworthy, then I'm going to create lots of experiences. I'm going to attract and draw myself into experiences that compound and add to and reflect back that feeling of unworthiness. That's much of where the state of my life had been. I was simply reacting to many, many things outside. And in those reactions, I was really completely separated from who I was, and essentially creating a bit of a snowball moving forward of more and more of less and less. When I made this rather fundamental choice to shift and become more aware of my thoughts and my feelings and realize that I had the power to change what I thought and I could change how I felt about myself, that began a new reality of which I began to grow and cultivate more of these innate qualities, more freedom, more peace, learning to take a deep breath when I was confronted with something that I didn't quite understand or resisted or resented. And in that deep breath, I was actually experiencing more peace, more freedom. And these 63 qualities are certainly just a short list, but they're profound qualities that are innate in every single person on this planet. They just aren't usually cultivated, and are, because of our psyche, individually, culturally, planetary-wise, we haven't really been taught how to cultivate these more positive, life-affirming, again, innate qualities that already exist within us. Whatever we place our attention upon, we expand. Whatever we expand comes back to us. So certainly in my some 20 years that I've been doing this more consciously, I have found each of these qualities have been expanding in my life. I've been having more and more and more of each of these loving qualities. Previous to that, I was having more and more and more of the fear, the doubt, the negativity, and all the other types of experiences. So I can understand where I came from, and I can see the value of choosing to cultivate more of these life-affirming, loving type qualities that are expressed in this book and many of the other things that I do now.
So are you talking about these qualities of having an attribute of love within them? I mean, in the sense that if you, for example, if you forgive someone, then that's a loving thing to do, isn't it? If you forgive yourself, that's a loving thing to do. And if you give someone freedom or dignity, all these different qualities seem to have an element of lovingness in them. This is not love necessarily for just one person. This would be a loving approach to everyone and every situation. If you're displaying these qualities, then you're expressing love in any kind of situation to anyone or any situation.
Yes, in this case, these qualities are universal in nature. Again, if you take the double words, unconditional love, that also connotes a universal understanding. And where these qualities are universal in nature, because in a way, if you step back and look at a greater humanity, if we kind of step off the planet and look down at the earth, there are no walls, there are no boundaries, there are no, really countries. It's really one humanity. And in that one humanity, it really doesn't matter what spot you pick on the planet. If you compare it to another spot, we all laugh, we all cry, we all have, our daily experiences, our momentary experiences, our life experiences. So yes, absolutely, what this evolves into is a much more universal understanding about life itself. It really begins, though, taking these qualities to heart and understanding them for ourselves, and it's very personal in nature. And so far as, say, forgiveness, for example, as an aspect, as a quality, the choice to forgive ourselves is a wonderful, great first step. Because in fact, if we learn to reorder our understanding to accept ourselves unconditionally, if we can go to a space where we forgive our past mistakes, our thoughts, our feelings, or our transgressions, whatever it is we may think about ourselves that we may have done, for example, in the past. And perhaps simultaneously, some of this, of course, and is certainly how it helped in my life, was to look at many of the very close things in my life. Was, as I was forgiving myself, I was also forgiving my parents, my siblings, my relatives, my friends, my neighbors, anybody that had really been in my life, as a way to expand this greater unconditional connection, to allow a more natural, universal love to exist between myself and myself and those around me. And that creates a tremendous release from all of these traditions, obligations, reactions. The many things that we do in life typically are usually reactions to something else in life. And very little of it is bound from or springs forth from the space where we are coming from each moment, looking at everything around us with a more universal eye, with a more open heart, with a more open mind. Certainly in those first few, days and years when I was beginning to understand this, there was quite a bit that I had to look at, both for myself and for those around me, to really grasp forgiveness, for example. And that's certainly if we would call a cornerstone aspect, forgiveness is a great one, because in the big scheme of things, this present moment is the only moment we have. This is the moment where we are literally, physically, emotionally, mentally, and one could say spiritually, one. The past is really a thought insofar as a memory, and the future is really our imagination and the play that we can create something of potential down the road. It's in this moment, though, that I can make a conscious choice. It's in this moment that I can align my thoughts, my feelings, my physicalness, and my connection to a greater awareness all at the same time, and I can choose something different. It's fundamentally is choosing to change a thought. So where I have a place that is, say, impacted, where I have a resistance, where I have a reaction to someone or something, I have the choice to continue that reaction, or I have a choice to let it go. And forgiveness is really letting go. And true forgiveness is really forgetfulness. And we forget as we forgive. We let it go so much that we simply don't think about it anymore. And one of the greatest indications of whether or not we're attached to something is if we keep reoccurring this notion in our mind and we keep addressing it, we keep feeling something about it, if we keep acting and reacting, whether around the person, place, or thing or not. In other words, if we revolve it in our consciousness, something from our past, if it draws away energy from us, that's a good sign that it needs to be forgiven. Mm-hmm. And forgiveness within, for me, for example, I had to really chose to forgive a lot of the ways that I looked at life that were very limiting, because I didn't know any better. Really the key to this is, if you don't know any better, we come from the highest place we possibly can. We make decisions where we're at. If we're in a state of anger and we choose unconsciously to react in anger, that's really the best place we can be. If we are in a state of joy and we choose to add more joy, that's the best state we can be. To be in anger, the hope is that we can recognize the anger at some point and make a different choice. And yet, practically speaking, in that state of anger, it's much easier to react in anger than it is to stop and take a deep breath and do something different. There are many instances in our life where we've done things like that, and we probably have regret and shame and guilt and everything else later down the road. Mm-hmm. Those are the types of instances I'm referring to where we can actually consciously invoke forgiveness and realize that, oh, hey, had I been able to understand that circumstance differently, hindsight, if I knew what I knew then, what I know now, all those cliches that we often use, those are the understandings that say, let it go, forgive it, release it, because it is in the past. It really has nothing to do with this present moment. Again, what we're doing for ourselves, we can also look around at experiences where we have actions and reactions with those around us, and again, apply forgiveness with those around us. And what happens when we do this, we remove the energetic connections to these experiences, again, mostly driven by the past beliefs, experiences, our views of how we thought things happened, which are very limited. What we think happened in a particular instance is only a tiny, tiny snippet of what actually happened, because there's always much more going on than that particular event seems to indicate. When we do these actions of forgiveness by consciously choosing to let it go, by consciously choosing and feeling, because again, forgiveness truly experienced is forgetfulness. And if we are doing it from the standpoint that we think we should because it's morally correct, or we're being taught that it's the thing to do, or somehow we think if we just willy-nilly say, oh, I forgive that, and walk off, when we're not really letting it go, we haven't actually accomplished forgiveness. It will come back around, and we'll have other opportunities, to do that. But certainly, the value of an aspect, say, of cultivating greater forgiveness in our lives, that which we begin with ourselves and those around us, 2 decades down the road for me, I have a much greater understanding of forgiveness for all the many woes that are currently experiencing on the planet. I can look at the various difficulties and challenges we face on our beautiful little planet Earth and say, well, there's a bigger picture going on here. And my understanding of forgiveness is that the planet and all the inhabitants would benefit more from forgiveness than from greater battle, greater challenge, or for somehow me adding my own anger or my reaction to the pot. Perhaps the planet would benefit, or the collective would benefit, if I actually would look at it from a greater sense of forgiveness, because I understand there's a bigger picture. So that's how it becomes more unlimited, to address how you say, it becomes more universal over time because it started very personally.
So we're all familiar with these different aspects: creativity, grace, abundance, choice, unity, vitality. We're all familiar with those, but I've picked up 3 words that you've used, which you seem to be using kind of synonymously, really. And one is unconditional, one is universal, and you've also said limitless. And I'm just wondering whether what you're talking about is developing these qualities to a much greater degree than perhaps we might ordinarily use them in our everyday lives. And the more we can use these, the more, in a sense, unconditional they become. Is that right? I mean, are we talking about a more absolute sense of these qualities?
Certainly from my experience, that's what happens. The more I cultivate all of these aspects with greater and greater freedom, with greater and greater release, with greater and greater forgiveness, with greater and greater recognition of the unlimitedness in each of these qualities, the more that limitless potential begins to blossom. And again, if you take, say, these qualities, creativity, abundance, which of these were the majority of us ever really given as suggestions in, say, our childhood? Which of these were actively cultivated within us? And we're generally cultivated with, everything from base survival instincts, depending on where we are on the planet, to a sense of, grand materialism where, you either have or you don't have, and then one is considered better than the other. And then we strive for all these types of things. We're really not trained, conditioned, schooled, educated, or literally just made aware of our innate ability, our innate potential, which is limitless. In other words, if we can come to an understanding about ourselves that right in this moment, I have a limitless imagination, and I have the willpower, the ability to actually act upon my imagination, I can create whatever I choose to place my attention upon. And certainly in the past 100 years on this planet alone, we have seen an explosion, literally an exponential explosion of what happens when we can actively engage our thoughts and feelings and create, from we go from horse and buggy to sending spaceships out into the far reaches of the universe. That's an amazing, tremendous exponential growth in where we were in consciousness in merely 1 century. If we were not coming from, say, our Western world fear, the fear of competition, that if we were to look at life, for example, and if we came growing up in the understanding that there was enough for everyone, more than enough for everyone, and that we were here to, say, do what our heart shares with us, say perhaps a young person is groomed in their childhood with schooling and with suggestions and with the idea from others that they would make an excellent lawyer, for example. So they go about and they become a lawyer, whether they wanted to or not, whether they ever stopped long enough to say, is this really what I want to do? They simply just followed the patterning, the suggestions, both the family suggestions and perhaps even the cultural suggestions. What would have been like if that child would have been raised in the understanding that they could follow their heart, that whatever their creative natural talents were, say, for example, the same person might have actually had extraordinarily natural talents with woodcrafting. They may have made an excellent carpenter, maybe an excellent finish carpenter. And in fact, if they would have been given the tools and the opportunities and the belief systems would have allowed them to expand that ability, they may have become, phenomenal wood artists and be bringing tremendous beauty to the people, by their natural creative talents. Mm-hmm. It's really the belief systems and suggestions that kind of condition either one of those. And what I'm, offering here is that if we can release our need to tell others how we think, or need other people to conform according to our models, and simultaneously realize that we don't need to conform to other people's suggestions and their models, there's a tremendously different approach to life that is, and I use the word innate, it is innate, and this is something that I stress very, very much and when I talk with people, is that these qualities are already there. They are in everyone. It's not something we have to seek, it's not something we have to go out and look for, it's not something we have to literally become through something outside of ourselves. They're already there. All we need to do is cultivate them. And if we can cultivate fewer belief systems, as many of us, we have ironclad beliefs that something has to be a certain way. We believe that, that's what we've been taught, that's the way it's always been done. Absolutely, there's no deviating from that. But look at even some of the simple things, it used to be like there was no breaking of a 3-minute mile until somebody did it. There were belief systems that simply couldn't be done, and then somebody did it. And 2 weeks after that one person did it, a whole bunch of people did it. Mm-hmm. If we started to look, and we are certainly doing, parts of this already, however, many of the foundational belief systems still, for example, are based on a cultural understanding of, say, competition, us against them. So there's some intrinsic cultural things that we are striving to shift. But despite these intrinsic cultural shifts, there's tremendous growth and evidence of what happens when we can continuously change and grow with our belief systems rather than staying static and staying stuck. And that's where this universal, unlimited, limitless potential resides. But it's up to each of us individually to kind of remove the layers of those things that keep us from that limitless potential.
So that can be quite challenging, can't it?
It can be challenging insofar as our resistance to change. And that's going to be dependent upon each individual. So, typically speaking, certainly after 2 decades of doing this and sharing this through books and workshops and various other methods, I would have to say almost the most common response is, oh, but it's really hard. And my instant response to that is, it's only hard if you make it. Because that it being hard is its own version of a belief system. People resist change. And they resist, essentially allowing themselves to reach their potential. And the more that resistance is there, the more challenging and more difficult it can be. There have been times in my life where I have resisted aspects, and certainly that brought about unnecessary challenge. Now that I look at it in hindsight, had I known then, and yet my approach from almost the beginning, once I got over this initial hurdle and decided to plant my feet firmly on self-awareness and self-growth and self-understanding, it has actually been a very easy path for me. And I'm not saying that it would be necessarily easy for everyone. I'm just saying the potential is there. It can be absolutely easy for everyone, depending on how open they are to changing the way they think and feel about life, themselves, the universe, and everything.
So for you, is applying unconditional love in your life a matter of developing these different qualities to greater degrees, and then in a kind of fairly spontaneous way you would be expressing more unconditional love?
For me, I think I took a rather interesting approach when I became aware of the idea of unconditional love so early in my kind of awakening pathway. It became clear to me that was a true foundational aspect of self. And others may come to the unconditional love, at different parts of their pathway. It may not be so readily obvious to them or necessarily need to be obvious to them right away. For me, love was one of the first things that surfaced and then kept resurfacing in all the various texts and audios and all the various things that I was accessing. This notion of love was the constant. So I took it upon myself to understand this love component, and very quickly the unconditional aspect, the counterpart to just the love word, which is again so commonly used. When you put the unconditional love piece to it, it really changes the very energetic dynamics about love, because it seems to be that unconditional love is really understood again on a universal level. When I share that with people, they seem to understand that means something far greater than just the simple word. My choice back in that time period was also to recognize that I could love myself unconditionally. I could consciously choose to love myself unconditionally, and I could consciously choose in that self-love to recognize myself and the rest of the people and humanity large around me. Those choices became kind of my life focus. Some you might call it a mantra or a guiding principle certainly wouldn't even call it a moral compass, because morality is, again, dependent upon culture and belief systems and traditions. They're intrinsic things in us. We know the difference between love and non-love when we really engage love, when we really go to understand it. My choice was to bring unconditional love as my guiding principle. So certainly over 2 decades of doing this very consciously, I've had the experience of more and more things rather naturally evolving in a more rapid fashion to unconditional love, because it is my guiding principle. In other words, it's the foundation from which I look at life. So when I have a moment of humanness where I react from something that is truly less than love, in those first moments, it might have taken the odd week or month or year before I would have said, oh, that wasn't very loving. Now, 2 decades later, it can happen within fractions of seconds. I can find myself acting or reacting, and then I can go right into that space of remembering very quickly, look at this from the eyes of unconditional love. That has taken a linear time, perhaps, of a couple of decades, and yet there's no explanation or quantitative measurement one can say as to when exactly did I become unconditionally loving. It's an ongoing process. It's an ever-evolving process, something that I think will expand well beyond this planet. Over time, we will continuously grow in greater understandings of unconditional love as we return back to, one could say, our innate oneness of self, that universal principle that's in all of us. To me, it has to begin somewhere, and I'm certainly not suggesting that everybody needs to jump out there and start saying, oh, it's all about unconditional love and I'm going to love unconditionally. Great if people had that inner desire. I'm just suggesting that that's a part of our pathway that can be entertained and looked at, and it can be done, with simply saying I'm going to start looking at life through unconditional love. It can be done by cultivating any one of these aspects. This particular book, was written as part of a greater series, in the sense that I thought if I would actually bring out the 63 core qualities, that a person could literally look at a quality a day or a quality a month and say, I'm going to see how freedom is experienced in my life. I'm going to see how abundance is experienced in my life. And, one of the things that's kind of funny about our pathways is the moment we ask for something, we usually get its opposite. If we want peace in our life, we often get everything but peace, because in the chaos, we can cultivate greater peace. And in that contrast, we understand a deeper level of peace. We go out and ask for abundance, we might find ourselves coming up really short of everything. And yet in that seeming lack, we will find an abundance that is really our innate nature, that has nothing to do with material things. And then we begin to understand what true abundance is. So these qualities are a tool, a technique, an awareness, an understanding, a way to expand unconditional love in our life in, say, individual terms, and somewhat dissecting it down to a particular aspect as a way to help us cultivate and focus upon one thing so that we can really make it more fundamental in our life. And in that, those aspects will again draw us back to greater unconditional love. Because again, whatever we bring in more unlimited will have that cascading effect in every other aspect of our life. And we'll find, certainly I have found over the years, many things naturally resolving themselves just because I'm choosing to look at life with unconditional love. I don't have to go out and fix or correct or forgive absolutely everything. Many things just begin to take on a life of their own because I'm simply coming and choosing to come from unconditional love.
Mm-hmm. So I guess that you'd say that one's individual life could be immeasurably improved by developing unconditional love, and thereby the world would be a better place if more people lived a life of unconditional love. And there are areas that come to mind straight away where unconditional love, I think, could be quite difficult to develop. For example, in one's one-to-one relationships, where there are all sorts of different things going on in them, and also in business relationships, perhaps even in maybe in quite a number of different aspects of everyday life. What about in sports, for example? So, are there ways in which unconditional love really can provide a much stronger basis for all kinds of activity in everyday life? Or, how do you incorporate unconditional love into, let's just go for sport, for example? What sort of approach would one take in sports? How would you, if you're competing, for example, against people, if you want to take advantage of people, how does that work?
Well, and again, this comes down to a fundamental way we view ourselves, whether it's in sports or in business, especially in the Western world. Those two seem to be somewhat synonymous in their underlying tendencies, their cultural cultivations. Say for sports, for example, what if sports was really, viewed as something as a way to assist one another to cultivate their innate talent, cultivate their innate strength? What if doing sports was a way to engage in like-mindedness and opportunities to give each person, party, team the opportunity to get a bit better? Well, in some ways, that's actually what's happening. And yet, we've kind of taken to the extreme of it's an us against them, win or lose. Sports can be made into a win-win. Business can be made into a win-win. And where I might say I have a bit more understanding is, say, in the business world, having come out of it, one of the reasons why I chose to leave the business activity that I had been involved with, I'd been trained in business, getting my master's in business administration. I'd also been working in a work environment in management capacities, and I could see what I was being taught. I could see what was happening in the business world. They've certainly mirrored each other quite well. Yet there was something in me that came from a very different place. For example, being in a management position, I understood why managers made decisions and did things for a greater vision overall for a company. I also understood, though, that the frontline employees, the people that were doing the core work, the ones that were making or producing or servicing the very frontline customers, their input was incredibly valuable. They couldn't have a vision if you didn't have the employees doing the activity. Being in that space, though, I also saw the conflict that raged between the two, and it was very difficult for me personally to be engaged in that conflict, because to me it was a wonderful circular flow where everybody recognized everybody with dignity and integrity, and everybody understood the roles that they played. That certainly was not my experience in the business world. From a management standpoint, I was being told and taught to treat the employees a certain way to achieve certain outcomes. And yet when I went to the employee side, I had great empathy and great compassion and tremendous respect for the activity that they gave and their insight and their awareness and their ability to make these things happen. And I think my choice was to move out of that whole arena to find out more about myself. I did have several opportunities within which to engage, and still do, to bring more of my understanding, loosely termed unconditional love, into the business world. What happens if we approach it from a standpoint that we really understand and respect that without the frontline employees, we have no business? And what happens if the employees really feel that the managers, the visionaries, have their best heart as an interest? What happens if we work together and value everyone's talents? What happens if we approach and look at our customers and our connection to the earth, the way we utilize resources? I've been fortunate to work in these environments with my understanding and say, what happens when we treat everybody? The person that's delivering the mail, the person that is, servicing a customer, the customer who is providing something that allows us to even be in existence. That's a much more universal, unified, holistic approach. One could, and certainly in the business world, it's not going to be the most easily bantered about phrase to say, my business is based on unconditional love. Well, I don't know if we can currently go into the sports teams and say, let's do unconditional love with our sports teams. The potential exists. And in some ways, we're practicing parts of it, but it is so fractured and so filled with so many beliefs and notions that we're really not able to approach it from a holistic standpoint, a more universal standpoint. if we can do this in our own lives personally, then we're going to have effect with our family, wherever we may be in a job. Perhaps, when we are out playing a sport, we might be able to just do it for ourselves. And over time, these things would evolve with that because we're choosing to look at it differently. And, the inertia is that we're, in most places, looking at cultures, societies that are developed on us against them, win or lose, the notion of competition. So to be a pioneer in collaboration, to be a pioneer in a holistic approach and a universal approach, and a dignity and an honesty and an integrity approach, there's going to be some interesting reflections. But yet again, like I said, if you want peace, you may experience non-peace. If you want collaboration, you might experience competition as a way to find ways to create more collaboration. So it really does have a very universal effect, and it will be driven by us individually by our choices. And I think that's something that I've experienced in my life, which is why I in turn share it with others, that the potential exists.
I think most people, I think, understand the concept of win-win, don't they, these days? I mean, that's a fairly common expression, and that's probably, I think, as you say, the way to go, really, isn't it? I mean, in sports, for example, I mean, I play tennis. I don't mind losing, but what I do mind is when I don't play very well. And so, in a sense, it's my opportunity to improve my own performance.
And to forgive yourself when you don't seem to play.
Sure, yes, yes. But the idea of destroying the opposition it doesn't have a very nice feeling to it. And and yet the idea of everyone playing really well and enjoying themselves because they're playing really well is a much nicer feeling to have. And the same, I'm sure,
driven by the individual. Again, I know that what we're talking about is very universal, and yet it is driven by the individual. The one thing I can do, the one thing you can do, the one thing any individual can do is change their perspective. And I think that is a true beginning point. We have choice. We don't need to stay criticizing ourselves. We don't need to stay belaboring ourselves, and we don't need to stay in a space where we're doing this to others. In fact, we're really only ever doing it to others because we're doing it to ourselves. And I think the wonderful understanding that I became aware of so quickly was I had far more choice in life than I thought I did. And I could do things so far as changing my thoughts and my feelings. I may not be able to, say, become an instant tennis player, which is the first time I step out on the court. But I could be an instant game changer in my own life by realizing that I had the power to place a more positive, more life-affirming thought next to a very negative one. That's something I can do readily, consciously, and of my own free will. And over time, the more I would build that momentum of more affirming, recognizing my innate, potential, the more I did that, the more it would literally change the outcome. So, what might have taken me, say if I would choose to take up tennis, if I was self-critical, I may never achieve, any decent performance on the tennis court because I'm driven by self-criticism. If I remove that, I might actually become fairly adept at playing tennis much quicker than if I go into the whole idea of playing tennis, from a critical standpoint. Those are the fundamental things that have a way of intrinsically going out in all these various avenues of our life, all these various aspects, and causing us to look at things differently. So, you could be in the grocery line, having one experience and saying, oh, people are talking about something that's very critical. I can choose to participate or I can choose to let it go. You can be out on the tennis court, you can be looking in the mirror. Various aspects of opportunity where when we change the core fundamental approach to life and look at life through bigger eyes and wider potential, we start to see things that we didn't see before. And that's really where the magic begins to happen, because it does take on a life of its own. It does begin to expand on its own in ways that the fear and doubt were also. Again, if we go back to that part where we're fearful and doubtful, that expands in our life too, because there are infinite ways for fear and doubt to expand, and we can never seemingly, resolve enough fear and enough doubt to get to the other place. because we're focusing on fear and doubt. What if we focus on greater love and greater potential? And that's all I really share with people is, what if? I can't say this for anybody because I don't know anybody's individual pathway and how it will work for them. I merely suggest this is how it has worked for me, and it has certainly made a profound difference in my understanding, and it's much more practical and tangible than many of the things that I had encountered that were either so far outside of myself. Unconditional love, for example, is often reverted simply to considered as a divine aspect, an intangible, untouchable, unreachable experience. And yet in 2 decades, I have a far greater understanding of unconditional love in my everyday life than I could have fathomed initially. And if I would have taken this approach that it was not something that was even attainable, I would not have the understanding that I have today, because I would have never taken that first step. So it's really that first step. It's that first choice. The choice to love oneself is a fundamental, huge step, and it has a way of changing everything else as a result.
Okay, well, in this book, Unconditional Love Is, Appreciating Aspects of Life, you devote a page to each of the different qualities. I mean, if you went into them much more, it would be a huge book. But it's what you do is to explain very briefly how each of these qualities relates to unconditional love. So, for example, you've got freedom, freely loving ourselves, those around us, and the rest of our world allows us to express our true selves in the noblest way. Now, what I'd really like to do is to go into these aspects a bit deeper with you, to sort of look at how, in a very practical way, in one's day-to-day lives, one can face situations where one can either choose to employ a more universal and unconditional level of each of these aspects, or not, and how challenging it may be, or how easy it can be if one appreciates how beneficial it would be to do that. So perhaps we could do that in a subsequent interview. But I think for now, thank you very much, and I think the viewers will appreciate having that rundown from you, and that sort of that introduction from you.
Sure. Well, a pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity.
Good. Thank you very much.